All right, so we're before Labor Day 2024, and I thought I'd make another recording of a paper. I'm going back in time quite a bit for this one. This is a paper that we published in the year 2000 that I published with my former PhD advisor, Nigel Priestley, and it's on a topic I've always really been interested in, and it's about the shear strength, or more specifically, seismic shear strength of reinforced concrete bridge columns. And I think with something like this, I'm talking about it because I really have a few reasons. One, I've always thought that this model is something that has been shown to be relatively accurate. It's something that we've used quite regularly, and as you'll see at the end of this little presentation, we've used recently in a blind prediction contest just a few years ago that turned out pretty well. So in order to really go through this paper, I have to go back in time a bit and talk a little bit about the history of seismic shear design. This photo was taken from the 14 West to 5 South collapse during the 1994 Northridge earthquake. And analysis of this structure ultimately concluded that shear failure of of one of the columns eventually precipitated collapse. At least that was our what our analysis dictated at the time. So how does this happen, right? So I'm going to go back to 1993 when my former advisor, in his very famous paper on myths and fallacies in earthquake engineering, conflicts between design and reality, talked about a lot of different things, but this quote is really prescient, where he wrote that the shear design of reinforced concrete is so full of myths, fallacies, and contradictions that it's hard to know where to begin in an examination of current design. I always found that to be a really kind of amusing and interesting quote. So if you don't know where to begin, maybe we begin at the beginning, right? So if we go back to say 1975 or even before then, how did we deal with shear strength? I mean, we really had no clear provisions for seismic shear strength that were separate from normal shear design in reinforced concrete. We effectively had V and the nominal resistance as being a combination of the concrete contribution and the steel truss contribution. That VS truss mechanism based on fundamental mechanics, but the VC in some way proportional to that well-established 2 square root of F prime C. And that's more or less what we did at the time, and there was no dependence of ductility, of VC on ductility, and it really wasn't understood at the time. So if we go to 1975 from the famous textbook by Park and Pauly, they wrote in that book that the contribution of stirrups and the shear resistance of reinforced concrete beams has been mainly determined from tests in which the load was increased monotonically until failure. In many situations, high-intensity repeated loading resulting from traffic or wind can be applied to a structure in some areas. In seismic areas, an even more severe criterion exists. So they started talking about this significance of cyclic loading, and this is also from their textbook. And what you can see in this figure is the effect of repeated loadings on the amount of shear that is resisted by stirrups in a beam. So first cycle loading, you'll see that you have some amount of force being resisted by the stirrups, but as you increase that number of cycles, the proportion eventually gets close to 100%, meaning that there's a degradation. So what they were showing in 1975 is a degradation of shear capacity from the concrete contribution, let's say, as you cycle a system. So in 1981, ATC 6 was published, and this is perhaps the first consensus sort of document. I wouldn't really necessarily call it a code document, but that sort of consensus report. It qualitatively indicated what Park and Pauly had suggested to be the case in 1975. And you can see this figure from that document, which shows on the vertical axis shear force, on the horizontal axis displacement ductility. And in some way, this degradation that occurs with increasing ductility, partially attributed to reduction in shear capacity as we increase ductility. But there were no numbers on here. It's really somewhat qualitative, but nonetheless, it's our first graphical attempt to really illustrate what had been shown in 1975. Fast forward several years later, and Guy Priestley and Pauly wrote this in their paper, that the performance of circular reinforced concrete columns under seismic attack has not always been exemplary, despite a common perception that they represent the optimum shape for seismic resistance. The San Fernando earthquake of 1971 produced several examples of flexural and shear failures of circular bridge columns, and similar failures have been reported from recent Japanese earthquakes. And then they talk about the 1967 Venezuela earthquake, where large circular columns suffered shear failures. So they go on to say that although shear failures in these and other recent earthquakes have been common, the shear strength of concrete columns under seismic loading has not received as much emphasis as the flexural strength and ductility. Nevertheless, determination of the shear strength of columns under seismic attack is a real problem. So in 1989 paper, Guy Priestley and Pauly defined this shear force versus displacement ductility envelope, further expanding upon what we saw in the earlier ATC document, which showed degradation of shear capacity with increase in ductility, now providing more indications as to how that degradation would potentially flow. 5 years later, Nigel and one of his PhD students, Ravindra Verma, and at the time a postdoc, Yang Xiao, developed what was the first iteration of what was called the UCSD shear model. And there were two key features of that model. Number one, there was a quantified degradation of the capacity of the concrete shear resisting mechanism with increase in ductility. That was a function of either uniaxial versus biaxial ductility. And the reduction started at a ductility of 1 or 2 and proceeded to a ductility of 3 or 4 where it plateaued. The second key feature of this model was the separation of the axial load from the overall contribution of shear capacity that had been typically in place within the concrete contribution, and still is in some models. So in this, what was called the UCSD model, we have the VC, which is a function of ductility, the traditional VS model, VS contribution, and then the VP contribution, which is explained by really statics and the horizontal component of the diagonal compression strut, which forms as the axial load enters and exits the column through the compression zone. So in single bending, the axial load entering through the top of the column, exiting through the bottom of the compression zone, and in double bending, the axial load entering through the center of the compression zone at the top of the column and exiting through the center of the compression zone in the bottom of the column. And it was the horizontal component of this force which was assumed to carry shear. So it attempted to quantify an aspect of the concrete contribution which had been largely empirical and pull it out on the basis of first principles. A couple years later, Nigel and another, at the time, postdoc John Mario Benzoni, had started doing some tests on lightly reinforced circular bridge columns. By lightly reinforced, 0.5% steel or so. And what they found is that they observed that in some cases we were seeing a more rapid degradation of shear with increase in ductility, and that this original consideration of how the degradation might behave may not be appropriate for higher levels of ductility. So with these more lightly reinforced columns that were able to go to higher levels of ductility, they were observing a more substantial increase in the shear capacity. So that led to this let's say, piecewise linear reduction. So instead of stopping at a ductility 4, a further reduction occurred to ductility 8, plateauing at that point. That model, that was version 2 of the model, and then that came to version 3 of the model. So this is something that I had the good fortune of working on with Nigel towards the end of my PhD dissertation, and we published this paper in 2000, which is a topic of what I'm describing today. And that three-component model had the concrete contribution, the steel truss contribution, and the axial load contribution. So the three components existed. Of course, those three components had been in place for some time, but we made changes to two of them, the VC and the VS, and in some cases, some rather significant changes. So for the concrete contribution, we made an adjustment by introducing two new factors, one to account for the effect of the aspect ratio. So the idea was that as columns become shorter, the joining members, footings, cap beams, have the effect of increasing the shear capacity of the component that it is connecting to. So that shorter column has a slightly enhanced capacity. Similarly, in terms of longitudinal steel, we found that as we have lower amounts of reinforcing steel, we have wider crack widths and, of course, greater degradation of the VC. That's something that's been reflected in other shear models over many years, predating the UCSD model. But we felt it was important to include that in this equation as well. And then another change to that ductility dependent factor, the one that really started that UCSD model, three-component model. What we did there is really just a minor change. Here we simply, instead of having that piecewise linear, we decided just to make it one line degradation from ductility 2 to 8 for uniaxial ductility instead of the two lines from before. And their reasoning was there's really no justification for suggesting that it was anything more complicated than this sort of straight line reduction. One of the biggest changes we made was to the steel truss contribution. And this is significant because what we did was to go back to the truss mechanism and recognize that the way in which this model was developed, decades ago, predating of course, the UCSD model, is by examining an assumed crack that forms at an angle theta to the vertical of the member, to the longitudinal axis of the member, vertical in the case of a column. And looking at how many transverse steel layers are crossed by that presumed crack at angle theta, and then determining that just on the basis of geometry. So we have n as being the number of transverse steel layers crossed by the crack, and then multiplying that by the area of steel and the yield stress. We made the change that recognizing that in the compression zone, the crack should be closed, not mobilizing the transverse steel. And that has a profound impact because it reduces the shear capacity of the VS model by around 30%. So this was a rather big change. The axial load contribution remains the same. That never changed throughout the entire history of the model. So the way in which that model was developed or applied, and this applies to any version of that model, but I'm showing here the final third version, is to calculate the theoretical flexural response, using moment curvature analysis. That's the blue line here, and then superimposing onto that the predicted shear capacity from the three-component model and looking for intersections. So you'll see here there's an intersection between that theoretical flexural response and the three-component model right around, in this particular example, around a displacement of about ½ inch. What you see surrounding this is now the prediction for a particular bridge column, and then you see the actual experimental data in black. And you see that for this, what we call brittle shear failure, brittle because it's happening at a low level of ductility, reasonably accurate. We captured about the point where the degradation starts, right around that level of ductility 2 or so. And similarly, for a column that suffered a more ductile shear failure at high ductility, you see that predicted degradation was right around that ductility 8 point, and that's where we started, in fact, to see it. So both in the case of the brittle and ductile shear, it worked quite well. Now, this is just an illustration, and just for two examples. So what you'll see in this paper that I'm sharing today is a comparison of the original UCSD model, version 1, the final model that we developed, the subject of this paper, version 3, both the design and assessment versions of the model. The design has a bit of conservatism in the form of a reduction factor. The assessment model has no such reduction. It's meant to be your best estimate. And then three other models, one of which is a design model employed by Caltrans some decades ago, and the ATC 32 and 40 models, which were assessment models at the time. So at 2000, in the year 2000, when this paper was published, these models were typically deployed. If you look at, and I'm going to show you a series of figures, 5 in total, that illustrate different physical tests and on the vertical axis, the ratio of the experimentally measured capacity of the column divided by the model prediction. So any column that suffers a shear failure, if you have V over V experimental over V design of 1, it means that the model exactly predicted the shear failure when it occurred. Now, as a design model, what you want is for it to be equal to or greater than 1. As long as it's bigger than 1, you're conservative. If you, of course, don't want it to be too conservative, but you want some degree of conservatism in a design model. You'll see on here these squares. They are brittle shear failures in the database. You'll see some circles, or sorry, diamonds. Those are ductile shear failures. And you'll see these circles. These hollow circles are actually flexural failures. We included some in the database as a check, meaning that a flexural failure, there should be no shear failure predicted. So we would expect those numbers to be always less than 1. So what you see here for this, the original version 1 design model is that in fact we don't have any circles above 1, which is good. We have a few below 1, but just below 1 in terms of some of these squares, but most of them are around 1.2, and they don't go much above 1.5 to 1.6. So it's not bad, somewhat conservative, but not a large amount of variation. The model that I'm showing in this paper, that version 3, you'll see much tighter predictions of the design model, right around a factor of 1.2. So we went from this. We went from. I guess we can't go back in this. So I won't do that here. We go to the Caltrans memo 20-4, and you see quite a bit more scatter, and in some cases, shear failure predicted where none occurred. There are a few outliers, but as high as 2, a factor of safety of 2, which you can debate whether it's too much. Then it gets interesting. We go to these, which are presumably assessment models of ATC 32, and it's all over the place, really. You see in some cases predictions of shear failure where none existed in some cases off by 100%. And in many situations, we have the experimentally measured strength being 2 to 3 times bigger than what these models, which are assessment models, were meant to accurately predict. The ATC 40 model, even a bit worse, right? So these models are not really suitable for assessment. They're all conservative for design, but really too much, in my opinion. And then you'll see here the version 1 of the UCSD assessment model. You'll see values now around 1, a little some below, which is non-conservative, some around 1. But again, this is meant to be mean value. And you see in no case do we have shear failure predicted where none occurred. And we also have variability plus and minus 20%. But this improved dramatically with the version 3, which I'm showing in this paper. Now we see results with a couple of exceptions between 90 and 110% of the actual outcomes, and no shear failures predicted where none occurred. So this was really quite promising. It shows the potential accuracy of this model as an assessment model. So I told you that one of the reasons why I wanted to show this today is that several years ago, sort of at the last minute, some of the people in our group, we got together in our research group and decided that maybe we should submit a prediction for the 2021 peer blind prediction contest. And it was actually at the encouragement of a couple of friends, Jose Versterpo being one, who was encouraging us to submit a prediction. And really just days before it was due, we didn't have a lot of time. We said, okay, let's try this. Use it as a teaching moment, to show my students at the time how you would apply this assessment of how you would go through an assessment of a structure, and perhaps apply that shear model if it's appropriate. So we went through a systematic evaluation to see what might happen to this column. There was a square column We were given the details, and that's about it. And this was the team that we worked with at the time. These are my students at the time. Some of these have gone on to graduate. Both Diego Sosa and Diego Martinez have moved on to teaching in Ecuador and Colombia. Julio's will graduating soon, and then Taylor is studying composites and is going to be graduating with her PhD soon. Anna and Lena are still current students. So we got together and we went through and looked at the critical sections. I'm going to focus just on the shear issues. We looked at other things as well, but we spent maybe a couple hours working on this. And we looked at the two critical sections, that which was well confined and that which had much less reinforcement. So that part of the column that had very tightly spaced steel. What we observed there is that shear failure probably not likely. So this orange line here is the shear capacity model, and there's a theoretical flexural response. We'd have to get to a displacement of about 300 millimeters to get there, and not going to happen because when we looked at the center of the column, where we had much more widely spaced transverse steel, we observed that we were going to cross the prediction envelope from the three-component model, very low levels of ductility, and at about 175 kilonewtons or so. It was, we remember we went through and said, are we sure? I said, well, this is what the model's telling us, so we're just going to submit these predictions. So but the predictions you needed to submit were what type? And we said, well, this is shear failure, preemptive diagonal tension. What is our predicted lateral strength from the three-component model? We had 176.5 kilonewtons. You had to predict the story drift ratio at the first excursion to three-quarter yield. We had to predict the displacement ductility, which we said would be about 1.2, and we then asked, do we need to retrofit at a story drift with 3%, which we said absolutely, yes. And this is what we found. It's maybe a little bit hard to see here, but we did pretty good in terms of the prediction. It was 175 kilonewtons. We got 176.5. That's lucky to be that close. I expected the model to be well. The fact that it's that close is fortuitous. The model's good, but there's some certainly good fortune to be that close, I believe. But nonetheless, we'll take it. We were happy with it. We had the ductility pretty close. You can see here we were a bit off in the drift at 0.75 times yield. We didn't really accurately assess the softening of the member in terms of deflections, but overall, otherwise, I think we did pretty good. It was a good learning experience, and to our surprise, we actually were awarded the first place for most accurate prediction in the researcher category. We tied with one other group who I believe we learned later also used the same three-component model. So I guess that's a good thing. So with that, I'm going to stop this recording in just about 20 minutes, and I hope you enjoyed it. Take a look at the paper. It's been out for obviously 20 some odd years. If you're not familiar with it, take a look and deploy it in your practice and research if you find it fit. Thank you, everyone, for listening.